The Wood Night is sponsored by I Would Like. When Bosch sent over their router, which I reviewed last month, you can check that out over here, they also sent over their track saw, their GKT 55 GCE, a 1600mm track and 2 track clamps. It has a 1400 watt motor. It uses 165mm blades to get the max of 55mm depth of cut at 90 degrees and 42mm at 45 degrees. Angle adjustment range from -1 degrees up to 47 degrees for some over beveling. It has some seriously easy blade change. The stock blade is a 48 tooth Freud made blade, and there'll be more on that later. The rails range from 800mm all the way up to 3.1 meters, with, in my opinion, the best length options at each step, and I'll cover that a bit more later. If you've been watching The Wood Night for any length of time, you'll know I'm a fan of track saws, having used a rebranded Chapac track saw as my only circular saw for a long time now. As such, I really didn't know what to expect from a proper trade grade saw. Sure, it costs more than the Chapac, but what could it do differently? From the first time I turned the saw on, I've got to be honest, it felt like they weren't even the same type of tools. Just about every misgiving I've had on the Chapac saw is a non-issue with the GKT 55 GCE. Just like with the router, Bosch have done a stellar job of all the ergonomics on this saw. The angle of the handle and the lowest spring tension than the Chapac make it so very comfortable to hold. My wife's first impressions on using it was, this is the first circ saw I've used that hasn't tried to kill me. With her smaller hands than probably the typical target demographic for most tool companies, it's good to know that this saw is usable by many. If I thought the dust collection on the router was good, I was absolutely blown away by the track saw. In typical Bosch fashion, it's listed as efficient dust extraction on their website, but if they told me it's 99%, I'd believe that. When flipping down the extra dust catcher thingy at the front, I noticed less than a teaspoon of uncollected dust after cutting down 5 sheets of melamine. My only complaint regarding dust collection is that the port is just a bit too short and doesn't create a great friction fit with the hose, meaning it can pop out from time to time. As I mentioned, the blade is made by Freud, a company that Bosch has owned since, I think it's 2009. It feels like the Freud industrial line with the ice coating rather than the Red Diablo range, but I don't have a lot to go on with that. Cut quality is superb. While a scoring mode that is found on many other track saws would be handy, depth adjustment is quick and easy and has a flippy thing to indicate whether your depth of cut is accurate for on-track or off-track use. While cutting laminates, which typically are a minefield for tear out, so long as I did a scoring cut, I had crispy cuts all the way along and the cut quality kept up with the table saw. Interestingly, this saw does not have a riving knife, while most others in the category, but not all do. A riving knife is there to reduce the chance of kickback as material falls away as you make the cut and pinches the blade. I typically cut sheet goods on my cutting platform, so that isn't too much of an issue for me, but the saw isn't just somehow restricted to sheet goods. Is it necessary? Well, most regular circ saws don't have riving knives and they've survived for quite some time now. Should it have it? To be honest, I'm not sure. While more features is usually good, if it's not useful, it's a waste of space. It may be more important if you're plunging into the middle of a board or using the saw for rough trimming of solid stock rather than man-made materials. I'm not sure. As I mentioned, the tracks are in some of the best lengths available. Bosch sent over the 1600mm track, which is great for cross-cutting a sheet of plywood. Plywood and most other sheet goods for that matter measure 1.2 meters wide. For this size cut, other brands have 1.4 meter tracks, and having used that size, I think it's just a little bit too short. Well, why? Well, you need to accommodate the saw before and after the cut to get the full depth of cut, unless you set it considerably deeper. And at 1.4 meters, that only gives you 100mm on either side. 1.6 meters gives you 200mm on either side, and it's far more comfortable. The rails are incompatible with all other saws other than Mafel, which share the same rails. Either Bosch makes the rails from Mafel or the other way around, I'm not too sure. This is also true for many of the accessories, as Bosch rails are very thin, so things like the clamps need to have much thinner heads. The saw itself, however, can be made compatible with other brands of tools by removing this filler strip, spacer strip at the bottom of the saw. To join the rails, you use the FSN Vel, which is considerably wider than other brands' connectors, which would create a more rigid connection. The FSN Vel can be stored in the track, in between these two parts here, when not in use, which is another nice touch. My final test of the saw was to determine the power. Compared to the Chapac saw, there is a noticeable difference even between cutting 16mm melamine. More than once I was sure I had the cut depth set wrong because anything below 19mm or so didn't feel like I was cutting anything. It was that smooth. The real test though was cutting a mitre on some 50mm thick red gum, which is almost as hard as ebony. While a cut depth of more than 25mm did slow the saw down, I wouldn't even subject my 1 3/4 horsepower table saw to cutting that much at once. And once again, wow, that dust collection. The 1400 watts seem to be pretty well matched to the cut depth, though I guess if you're in America or the UK where you don't have as hardwoods, perhaps 1200 watts would do just fine. The only downside with the power I can see is that with some vacuums, mine included of course, have auto start ports that only go up to 1200 watts, so this needs to be plugged into a separate circuit. If this was the only saw on the market, there probably would be nothing to complain about, but like the router review, it doesn't live in a vacuum. All of these trade quality track saws are expensive, but their GKT 55 just doesn't include as much stuff as the competition, which makes it feel less value for money, but when comparing spec for spec, that may not be true. However, onto the bundles. Currently you can get the GKT 55 GCE set, which is essentially the kit I have. That's the saw, the rail, this size rail, the 2 clamps, plus a bag for 850 Australian dollars. Makita's bundle at $950 includes the container for the saw, 2 1.4 metre tracks, the saw, bag, track, connectors, although inferior, and clamps. DeWalt have the same sort of bundle for about $50 more, which includes the same stuff as the Makita and some admittedly less than useful hose adapters. Festool have bundles too, but they're all less value for money than anybody else. However, there are a few things in Bosch's favour. I found that the 1600mm track is better than 1400mm that the others offer, which I've discussed. And curiously, the Bosch saw is the only one with a 1400 watt motor. The DeWalt and Makita come in at 1300 watt, while the Festool TS55 is a 1200 watt motor. Without having a direct comparison, that may be meaningless, I'm not sure, but it is an interesting point of differentiation. Finally, both the Bosch and the Makita lack a riving knife, while the Festool and DeWalt have them. I've talked about the riving knife already, lack thereof, so I'm not sure how interesting that point is. So where do I stand with the GKT 55 GCE? Well, overall I'm super impressed with this saw, with the standouts being ergonomics, dust collection and raw power. I've tried not to come across as a bit of a fanboy, so I've been digging around to try and find issues with it. Unlike the router that I reviewed, Bosch Australia imports all the accessories. Well, the router I called a little bit expensive, but I can't call this overly expensive because all the pro-grade track saws fall into about the same price. The best I could come up with on the negative front is it doesn't have a riving knife. It'd be nice if they threw in an L-box, and a scoring mode would be handy to have. Other than that, I can safely recommend this saw as something you won't regret purchasing. Thanks for watching.